Okay then, just spend a moment looking at the role of Bretton Woods in the post-war world economic order. Having looked at the establishment of the Bretton Woods system and the Bretton Woods institutions, it would be wrong to leave you with the impression that in the immediate post-war period that those two institutions were massively significant, because they weren't. In fact, they were largely peripheral to the post-war international economic system in several respects. Both the World Bank and the IMF were largely replaced in their role as recycling dollars to the rest of the international economic system and providing balance of payments adjustment between the United States and Europe by the Marshall Plan, which provided direct aid to Western European countries in return for agreements around foreign direct investment, which provided a mechanism for recycling dollars, US foreign direct investment, that is, in Western Europe, particularly in Germany, in the immediate post-war period. And you can see this, for example, if you look at IMF lending activities during the post-period, which were very minimal indeed, up to the early 1970s, and then really began to take off with the significant loan to Britain in 1976, which is another turning point, effectively, in the narrative story about the battle of ideas over the relationship between state and market in the 20th century. However, Bretton Woods is still seen as significant in the post-war period because of what's called the Bretton Woods system for the most part, which is about controlling capital flows, which was about making finance a servant, which was about stabilizing currencies and in particular having fixed exchange rates between different currencies, facilitating international trade and institutionalizing US leadership. Although on one of those measures, the controlling capital flows, what you will have noticed from the reading that you were given for this week, the Eric Helleiner chapter, is that many of the capital controls envisaged by the Bretton Woods planners were never fully implemented, and that's significant in terms of telling the next phase in the story of the battle of ideas around the relationship between state and market. I'm going to briefly touch on the experience of Bretton Woods in that next chapter of the story of the relationship between state and market then, but I'm not going to do that in a great detail, or as much detail as I've told the story of the establishment of the Bretton Woods system, because that really is the content for the rest of the module. So we can look at this in several phases. First, having said that the IMF and World Bank were peripheral in the immediate post-war period, after around 1976 they became rejuvenated organisations, particularly after the IMF's loan, as I said before, to Britain in 1976, which marked the transition, or the beginning of the transition, of the British economy away from Keynesian social democratic ideals about economic policy to more free market, a more free market approach. Both organisations, particularly the World Bank, were reorientated in the 1980s to dealing with the debt crisis in the developing world, and to some extent that's how we tend to see those organisations today. They became the architects in this period of what is known as structural adjustment in the developing world, and therefore are often seen as agents or agencies that were tasked with the project to implement that transition from post-war social democratic Keynesian to more free market ideas about about the relationship between state and market, particularly in the developing world, and they began to take on a much more surveillance orientated role. I said they were responsible for structural adjustment. So what is structural adjustment? Well, that was largely part of the deal for providing part of the conditions for providing help with the debt crisis, and those conditions tended to reflect a reduction in state spending on welfare, curbing corruption, privatising state-owned assets, liberalising both trade, that is product markets, and also capital, that is finance markets, and providing guarantees on the security of foreign investment. That is, foreign investors would have legal guarantees that the state would not try and expropriate their assets, such as factories or oil production facilities and so on. The role of the Bretton Woods organisations can be seen to change again in the late 1990s to around now, particularly associated with a president of the World Bank in the late 1990s, Wolfenson, and an economist that you may well cross, Joseph Stiglitz, who was deputy president of the World Bank and also chief economist, when the World Bank in particular that reorientated itself away from structural adjustment towards poverty reduction and something it called pro-poor development, and belatedly the IMF also adopted that mantra, which is, depending on one's perspective, either a superficial shift away from the policies of structural adjustment or a real shift away and towards ensuring that development assistance in particular is orientated towards benefits the poorest sections of the population. And then there's a question mark about a possible fourth phase of the development of the organisations in the contemporary period. And the current economic crisis has given rise to an awful lot of debate about how the international financial system might be restructured, and included as part of that the IMF. And you will see debates in the G20 and the UN Commission, and I've provided links to these in the resources section at the end, about how the international financial system might be reformed, including proposals for something called a Tobin tax, which would tax a proportion of international financial flows and put that money to a variety of different means, depending on the version of the Tobin tax proposed. Either wealth spending to secure benefits from what are often regarded as the losers from globalisation, or to provide effectively a stabilisation or a firefighting fund in the event of an international financial crisis. But importantly, as part of all the debates, is a trend towards providing more of a say in how the institutions of global economic management might be controlled by developing as well as and emerging market economies, as well as the United States.